Nowhere in the pages of history can one find a greater champion of justice. Return with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear.
And I'll tell you something else, too, is I cannot stand sissies.
You're going to talk about wrestling, that's redneck talk.
And guess what, fatso? I'm the world champion.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the 1,000 Hours podcast series from WhenItWasCool.com, WrestlingObserver.com, Figure4Online.com, and I am your host, Karl Stern. Thank you very much for joining me. This is hour number 63 of the 1,000 Hours podcast series, the podcast all about the pioneer era of pro wrestling. And, of course, I am also the author of the new book, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Pro Wrestling, available on Amazon. If you want a quick way to get there, just go to WhenItWasCool.com and you'll see a prominent ad there. Go to Amazon, just type in Wrestling Omnibus book, should bring it up. And look, hey, I'm very, very happy about the sales of the book so far. I would say my optimistic appraisal of where I wanted to be by the end of 2024, I am maybe slightly behind the number of books I wanted to sell for that, but not by much. I mean, I'm talking about, I'm only just maybe 4 or 5 book sales behind, and that can easily be made up in a day's time. The book has generally been stationed in the top 100 of pro wrestling books at Amazon for most of its ride so far. It got all the way up to almost the top 5 as number 1. The highest I ever saw it ranked was number 6 in pro wrestling books, and then it also ranks in U.S. history books for Pioneer Era, because it really should appeal to history fans as well. So I hope you'll check that out, DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. And that's what we're doing now here on the 1,000 Hour podcast, is we're going through the book with more extended commentary and take a look at some things maybe I learned in the process of researching the book about the Pioneer Era of wrestling, and much, much more. Now, these episodes are sponsored. The only way we keep this podcast going is to have a sponsorship for it. And the sponsor for this episode is PWO. And I don't know what that stands for, but PWO became a Patreon supporter at WhenItWasCool.com. So this hour is in dedication to them. Thank you very much. And that's how you keep getting episodes of this program. Every time I get a new Patreon supporter at WhenItWasCool.com, I dedicate an hour of this show to them. Or if you're already a Patreon supporter and you want to sponsor this particular show, or maybe you're just, listening on a free feed or something like that, you can make a cash donation. The front page of When It Was Cool has links, has those little QR scan codes and links to PayPal and Cash App. And I've just been leaving up people to donate whatever they think an episode's worth. We've had contributions from $10 all the way up to, I think, $80 was the most we've had for an episode so far. So whatever you think is of value to you, hope you will sponsor an episode to keep this going. So as of right now, we're sponsored through hour 87. So we still got, over 20 episodes that are already sponsored ahead. So it's not, just urgent we get a new sponsor right now, but it is pretty urgent we get you over at When It Was Cool and get you on our Patreon so you can listen to all of our podcasts and stuff, of which there are many. We put out a new podcast almost every single day, and I'm hoping everybody in 2025 really we're putting on a huge effort. Look, it's ever so often, I'm a huge podcast consumer. Ever so often, I need to refresh my feed. I need some new stuff to listen to. And we hope When It Was Cool becomes that for you. We've got over 2,000 shows in our archive, dealing not with just pro wrestling history, but retro pop culture as well. Some different stuff. So I think if you just give us a month or two, join up on our Patreon. It starts only at $5. I mean, heck, that's nothing. You can't even get a value meal to drive through for that anymore. But $5 to get you a month. You can cancel any time. But I think you'll really like what you see over there. Well, let's get into this. Let's dive into DragonKingKarl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. And we're picking up here in 1847. If you recall from our last episode, we're looking at the career, what's known of the career of the first person I can find in my research that was a pro wrestling star in America. And by that I mean not just a guy who traveled with a circus. The circuses would put on wrestling as an attraction. There's numerous examples of that which we've talked about. But this is actually, this person, the King of Wrestling Charles is his name. He worked with circuses, but besides that, even when he wasn't with a circus, he would go town to town, putting out billboards, challenging the, whoever, taking on all comers. They would even sell tickets to this. He had a confederate by the name of Carriere, who followed him around, would stand up and challenge him. So you see, this is show business already from literally the first person. And I would wager that most of you probably have never heard of King of Wrestler Charles before. I haven't. Many of the wrestling historians that I've so devoured their work, if I've ever saw him mentioned, it was just in passing. And we really don't know that much about him. Even, I went through several hundred newspapers trying to figure out who this guy was, and there's really not that much we can nail down about him. But as we go into 1847, we're still before the United States Civil War here. And the King of Wrestler Charles, he's still up in the Northeast, although he's going to travel around a bit. So June 4th, 1847, King of the Wrestlers Charles reappears, this time in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and issues a challenge to Mr. Eugene, who is called the strongest of the Hercules. No results are published. And so you gotta, one thing we really do when it was cool, and 2025 is only going to be this, multiplied by a million than we usually do. We like to look around the pop culture implications and influence of pop culture on wrestling and the influence of wrestling on popular culture. Here in 1847, yes, there was a popular culture. Now, no, they didn't have TV. They didn't even have radio. There were no films. But for entertainment, the town would gather at the local opera house or theater and watch shows. They would watch plays, maybe Shakespearean plays or different famous plays that were out there. That was their version of the, quote, movies. There would be orchestras. There would be magic shows. There would be physical culture shows. And this idea of the, quote, Hercules, of course, the figure from Greek Roman mythology, Hercules, the strongest of men, and they would celebrate that ideal in these different early physical culturists would play the role of Hercules in different skits and plays and do like strongman feats and stuff. And it's no wonder that crosses over with the world of wrestling, even from the very beginning. Think about how over the years in modern wrestling history, how many strong men have crossed over into wrestling, because it's just a natural thing. I mean, there's Braun Strowman. There it was Ken Patera, of course. There was the Ted Arcidi. Many people who have been power lifters and Olympic weightlifter. Mark Henry, obviously, one of the strongest men maybe to ever live was Mark Henry. So the song remains the same, everything is new again, so to speak. Even from the very beginning, King of Wrestlers Charles was going around and challenging some of these physical culturists, Hercules types, to matches. And this was taking place here in Philadelphia. On June 27, 1847, King of the Wrestlers Charles is back in New York City giving exhibitions at the Bowery Circus. So he worked with not just the Bowery Circus, but other different circuses as well, but also on his own, has his own act, it appears. At the Bowery Circus, it is said he threw 4 challengers successfully. And, throwing them back then under the rules of wrestling meant beating them, what we would consider today a pinfall or a submission. Back then it was throwing or pinning your opponent to the ground. So he beat 4 people successfully. King of the Wrestlers Charles then took on Yankee Sullivan, who was a boxer, This is, again, the early days of boxing in America as well. It was a gloved boxing match. Of course, predominantly it's bare knuckles boxing back then, right? It is said that Charles received a black eye, though he did win the boxing contest. So he's into all this physical culturist stuff. Exactly the kind of people you would expect the first pro wrestler in America to be hanging around, boxers and strong men, and putting on these performances. That's what he's doing. October the 8th, 1847, the Bowery Circus again promotes wrestling. This time, the combatants are named Sam Lee versus Jack Riley, and it's for $500 a side. So here in 1847, it's rare we get the names of wrestlers. What we would get periodically would be the newspaper saying, and again, you got to remember, it's before Civil War, there aren't even photographs in the newspapers or anything. Like, photographs are way in their infancy. And so there's not like a picture. We don't know what Sam Lee or Jack Riley or even King of the Wrestlers Charles, we don't really know what they even look like. Sketches started being popular a little later on in newspapers and stuff. So we get a rough sketch of some wrestlers from time to time. A lot of times I'll use those sketches as artwork for this podcast. And those come actually from the old newspapers. So don't know anything about Sam Lee. I don't know anything about Jack Riley. It's rare we even get a name for wrestlers back then. So you can see, I mean, it's the coffee is starting to percolate here. The ingredients are in place. This is becoming a budding field of entertainment in America. 1848, January 25th, 1848. 500 people are reported to see a wrestling match in New York City near the South Brooklyn Market. We get names for this one too. In fact, these names would show up a few times in the future. Levi Martin versus Martin Titus for $100 a side. The two were said to be, quote, celebrated wrestlers. The match went to a draw. The match was reported by the newswires and newspapers all over the United States. So why is this important? Well, it's a very early example. 1848, this is very early. This is really not even what I would call the pioneer era yet. It's getting close, but this is just putting all the ingredients together to bake the cake that is pro wrestling. But here it is, 500 people. That's a respectable crowd, and this seems to have every indication of being a sporting wrestling match. They got monies on the side. These two people appear to be, as a profession, wrestlers. They're, quote, celebrated wrestlers. And again, this is in New York City, near South Brooklyn Market. Maybe some of you living in around New York City know where that was, or maybe still even is. I know we got numerous listeners from the New York City area, and maybe you know where this is or was. But in 1848, some of the earliest pro wrestling in America took place there. But why would you care if you lived in, say, Atlanta, Georgia, or New Orleans, Louisiana, or San Francisco, California, or Dallas, Texas? These cities which are growing, thriving, and starting to become major areas across the United States. They heard about this through the newspapers. The newspapers read it. So yes, if you were living in, San Francisco, California, you very well could have read this report of this wrestling there. And, San Francisco would end up being a major hub of wrestling even in the pioneer era. February 1st, 1848, in Brooklyn, New York, in front of a large crowd, Levi Martin again took on Martin Titus. This time they go to a 60-minute draw. So we have more than one match here with these people. February 4th, 1848. So here we go. We're down in New Orleans now. This isn't the Northeast. We've seen King of the Wrestlers Charles up in New York and Baltimore and Pennsylvania and all up in that Northeast metropolitan region now. When you think of it, you think of the giant city that essentially exists from Washington, D.C. all the way up to New York City. That's where they've been. But now they're in New Orleans, Louisiana, so they're a ways away. The New Orleans, Louisiana newspapers report that Eugene Carriere was arrested after he was found to be carrying $373 away from Alexi Charles. So here we get a possible name for King of Wrestler Charles, Alexi Charles. Well, I don't know. I don't know nor buy that that's his actual given name. He's obviously a Frenchman. French wrestling, professional wrestling, has been well established at this point, as we've talked about it. Some of the biggest future wrestlers in America are wrestling in France right now. He's obviously, King of the Wrestler Charles is a spin-off of that, probably a former wrestler there or a wrestler there. I've heard some names mentioned, and in wrestling historian groups, there's been some discussion about who this could be, but I don't think any of us have really nailed down for sure if it was a guy who's famous. Probably was famous in France. We just don't know exactly which one. But anyway, so Carriere's apparently stealing $373, or maybe he's in cahoots together and they're stealing it from, the gamblers. I don't know, but he got arrested for it. It was said that this was the wager money between the two for the wrestling match. So unclear from the newspaper accounts if Carriere was stealing the money from Charles or if this was an attempt at swindling the people who bet on the match. Now I have here a DragonKingKarl note. Von Hern, Alexei, King of the Wrestlers, Charles. So that's all the names we know of him being called up to this point. Von Hern, Alexei, King of the Wrestlers, Charles is someone we know little about. But if you used archived newspapers in America as a chronology, then he is the first wrestling, quote, star that they write about. By that I mean a person who calls himself a wrestler, who advertises wrestling matches to the public. Charles, whoever he may have been, was written about extensively in the Northeast United States and in New Orleans as well. It seems as though he worked with this Eugene Carriere fellow, and they carried their act around the country, where Charles would make grandstand challenges and then would be challenged by Carriere. Charles seemed to quickly disappear from the newspapers by 1850. I'm imagining he goes back to France and probably is one of the known French wrestlers over there. We just don't know which one he is. June 30th, 1848, a tragedy occurs. Now, this is not really professional wrestling, so to speak, but this was such a horrific tragedy. You think about it. I had to put it in the book because it relates to wrestling in a fan sort of way, or a imitation sort of way. June 30th, 1848, a tragedy occurred in Springwater, New York, blamed on wrestling. Several men were framing up a house when two boys who were helping them engaged in a wrestling match. One of the boys was thrown in the match. So this is two. We don't really know the ages of these kids. Presuming since they're helping the grown men frame up a house, which means, you probably saw the Amish, raise a barn or something. They build these walls and stand them up. Several of them stand it up and then they shore it in place. So it's a lot of heavy work. So if they're old enough to be helping out with that, I imagine they're, preteens or teenagers or something like that. But what happened was they're having a wrestling match and one of the boys is thrown in the match and died. Was killed by the wrestling match. His father and the people that are helping him are holding up this wall. The father becomes so severely shocked that he let go of the wall and that the men were raising up by hand, and it collapsed, killing 6 of them. In all, 7 people were killed over a childhood wrestling match. The story was carried in newspapers across the United States. Now, is this true or is this embellished somewhat? I don't know, but I do know this. This story was carried for months all over the United States. And very interesting. Just, again, not pro wrestling per se, but certainly the influence of wrestling was there. Was the catalyst that sparked this great tragedy of 7 people killed in 2 separate accidents at the same place, crazy. November 15th, 1848. Edwin Bibby was born in Lancashire, England, and Edwin Bibby would be a major wrestling star over in England and here in the United States as well. He would be well known when the Pioneer era really flexes its muscles. October the 12th, 1849. This is a crazy story. We think our politics today are insane, and they are. Make no mistake. Crazy all the way around. Listen to this. October 12th, 1849, at the Whig, WHIG, the old political party, the Whig political convention in New York City, 2 members engaged in a wrestling match. And while no names were given, one suffered a broken back and died. And this was reported, the way this was reported in the newspaper, it sounded like not a fight, but a friendly, hey, we're standing around waiting to vote on whatever it is Whigs voted on back then. And they got in a friendly wrestling match, and one of them received a broken back and died. I mean, politicians, what are you going to do? 1851. March the 21st, 1851, in Hagerstown, Maryland, Thomas Calliman was arrested for murder. It was following a wrestling match with Hanson Whelan, a black man. Whelan began bragging to onlookers about throwing Calliman. Calliman then took a pipe and hit Whelan in the head, killing him. Now, I put this in here to say this, that this does, from the stories in the newspaper, appear to have been a sporting wrestling match, not just a drunken fight, as the newspapers often would use wrestling as a term for simply a street fight. This appeared to be a sporting wrestling match, and again, one of the interesting things that stands out is you have presumably a Caucasian white person against a African American, a black man named Hanson Whelan. We know a lot about, or we know a pretty good bit about, Black Sam, Vero Small, a former slave, and his time in wrestling, and we'll certainly talk about him going forward, but he was not the first. And while he got a lot of publicity, I wouldn't say a lot of publicity, he got some publicity in the newspapers and stuff, there were others, and we'll see them. We'll run across them. In fact, there's the famous story of Oozle Prickett and setting up a worked wrestling match in Nashville, Tennessee with a black man and letting the black man beat him and nearly getting himself hung for it. I mean, they rioted, they chased him to the hotel and everything else. And that was with the American Championship. And that was the top championship in America at the time. So African-American wrestlers, black wrestlers were... it's interesting to find. I won't say they were unique in wrestling, but because of the way things were in the South, obviously the slaves had not been freed yet, the Civil War hadn't happened. Any of these we see are interesting historically for many reasons, for social reasons more than even just pro wrestling reasons. And so Hanson Whelan, don't know much more about him, don't know really anything. Know he died right here. I don't know how much he wrestled, how often he wrestled, how serious a sporting wrestler he was, but a very telling story to be sure. September the 12th, 1851, Karl Abbs was born in, I'm going to try these names, Grobgonums, Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Now, if I butchered that, I apologize, but Karl Abbs is going to be a major name over in Europe and in the United States as well later on in the pioneer era. March the 8th, 1852, we mentioned Edwin Bibby a minute ago. Well, his chief rival, Joe Acton, who is going to be a major star here in the United States as well, Joe Acton is born in England. Along with Edwin Bibby, Joe Acton is partly responsible for helping introduce catch-as-catch-can wrestling to the United States. Catch-as-catch-can took many of its elements from Lancashire wrestling, of which Acton and Bibby were accomplished. April 19th, 1852, Tom Cannon was born in Manchester, England. He would be a name here in the United States as well. And May 25th, 1852, this is about as red flag a day as you can get. William Muldoon, one of the most influential grapplers in history, is born in Canada, Allegheny County, New York. His parents were Irish immigrants who had arrived in America during the 1830s. William Muldoon later died at the age of 81 on June 3rd, 1933. So, king of the wrestlers, Charles, the first American star wrestler, when he is wrestling is when William Muldoon is born. So if that helps you kind of place things chronologically, it's going to be, a good 20 years before we get to William Muldoon's career. And wrestling had already the seed was planted, so to speak, here in America. All right, we're going to take our mid-show break, come back. We're going to get into 1853 as we continue to look back through my book, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Wrestling, available at Amazon.com. Go check it out, and we'll be right back after this. Hey everybody, this is Karl Stern from WhenItWasCool.com. I'm here to tell you about my new book, now available, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling didn't start with Frank Gotch. He didn't just appear out of the void to bring us entertainment-style professional wrestling. No, it was built on a legacy some 70 to 80 years old. That's what I'm going to talk to you about, an era of wrestling in America seldom ever discussed, never before in this detail. I have put 700 pages of information about the pioneers of professional wrestling, like William Muldoon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, Professor Theobald Bauer, Clarence Whistler, William Miller, and so many more. Maybe some names you've never heard of before, maybe some you've only heard in passing. I will tell you the origins and evolution. Now available, Amazon.com, WhenItWasCool.com. All right, we're back, and again, encourage you to pick up my new book, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus, the Bible of the Pioneer Era of Wrestling, from Amazon, as we continue to look through the book here on 1,000 Hours Podcast. 1853 is where we are up to, and we're going to start on April 7th, 1853. A circus benefit was held in New York City, New York, which promoted wrestling bears as an attraction. The spectacle of men wrestling bears and featuring bears wrestling each other was a common circus promotion in the 1800s. We've done some earlier episodes about this. I think one of our great, very important Patreon supporters, Andrew, had actually requested a show about this early on in the 1,000 Hours, which you can get from our archives there. And I had no idea myself. And when I researched that show for him, I'm like, yep, there were wrestling bears back in the 1800s, no doubt. I had no idea they were actually a regular attraction. Like, wrestling bears are going to be very much a part of pro wrestling in the 1800s. The bears would wrestle each other, and the bears would wrestle people. In fact, there's going to be some pretty spectacular stories coming up ahead in the book about some bear wrestling going wrong. And we'll look at that for sure. I know Ron Fuller on his podcast had said, his grandpa, Roy Welch, had one of the first wrestling bears and traveled around. And there's no doubt, I'm sure Ron believes that story, and certainly Roy Welch had wrestling bear and toured it around and stuff. But they were wrestling bears all the way back in the 1850s, so it wasn't anything new, even when Roy Welch was doing it, circa World War II. So very interesting. I don't know why is it that people want to fight bears. I have no idea. Why is that an attraction? I don't know, but it's been around for a long time. October the 7th, 1853, the Vermont Standard newspaper, which was running an editorial on a potential temperance law for Windsor County, says, quote, "For under the operation of any of our former laws, we should have been disgraced with a dozen rings of wrestling, as many regular fights, and a copious sprinkling of drunken loafers." So why is this in the book? Well, it just goes to show that in this era still, and would be for some time to come, the newspapers, the media, had a very negative opinion of wrestling. Still does, pretty much always has in my lifetime, even when wrestling was red hot back in the 80s when I was a big fan. News media, when they covered it, it was nothing more than a way to make jokes, have puns. It was always something silly, tongue-in-cheek. It was never treated seriously, despite the fact, millions and billions of dollars were made by this industry. They treated it as a joke, and the newspapers treated it with great contempt, even back in the Pioneer era. November the 29th, 1853, in Brooklyn, New York, Cumberland Street and Park Avenue. Squareback Fall rules. Molyneux, who real name is Aaron Hewlett, somehow they sourced this guy's real name out. Molyneux defeated Cesar Cote in 3 falls. So we have a report of a wrestling match there in 1853 New York. December 1st, 1853, the Buffalo, New York Hippodrome is disbanded when the performers returned to France. Among the acts which had been featured were a troupe of wrestling bears. Yes, they had wrestling bears in their circus. December the 20th, 1853, a letter to the Washington, D.C. Evening Star newspaper complains to the editor that the walkway in front of the Willard Hotel is now being used for sports such as boxing and wrestling, and they're demanding that the police do something about it. So here again, more bad publicity for wrestling. 1854. January 17th, 1854, Brooklyn, New York, 3 Mile House. Attendance, 2,000 people. There's nothing to sneeze at here. Now, it was probably in conjunction with other events. It probably wasn't just this wrestling match. But square side hold, Cesar Coit defeated John Mingo, 3 falls to 1. The earliest hot epicenter for wrestling in America was Brooklyn, New York. We're going to see Brooklyn, New York, especially once Harry Hill comes around. Harry Hill's probably around right here, as a matter of fact. Brooklyn, New York, if you just had to, no pun intended, here I am doing the puns. If you just had to pin me down and say, in what city, what geographical location in the United States of America could it be most said wrestling started at? I would have to say Brooklyn, New York. We've seen the circuses there. We've seen the King of Wrestling Charles there. We see 2,000 people coming out for a wrestling match. In 1854, Harry Hill is going to set up his theater there, which is going to heavily feature and promote wrestling. It's the center. I mean, there's wrestling already all over the country. Variously all over, maybe not all over the country yet, but Brooklyn, New York is the hot spot of it. It's the genesis of it appears to be there. February the 8th, 1854, Henry Stevens, 39 years old, the stage manager of the Bowery Theater in New York, died after wrestling with William H. Hamilton. Now, the match was an informal one, which began with a discussion of strength between the two, and resulted in a challenge to a 3-fall wrestling match. It was said they both fell 3 times together, the final time, however, resulting in a spinal injury to Henry Stevens, who died the next day. An inquest was held, and the result of the death was ruled accidental. William Hamilton was later reported by the newspapers to have gone, quote, insane from the death of his friend. So there again, New York City, the Bowery, Brooklyn, Manhattan. It's rightfully, just pay attention as we go through the pioneer era, how many times New York City, specifically Brooklyn, specifically the Bowery is mentioned. That's the real, I guess, it may not have been the first wrestling match in America, but it's the home to where wrestling becomes organized. February 15th, 1854. In Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, the Chambersburg Whig newspaper reports that 2 people have died in the last week from wrestling. One, Henry Stevens, from a broken spine, and the other, who is unnamed, from, quote, ruptured intestines. A separate newspaper reports of Edward O'Donnell breaking his ankle and may be, quote, lame for life while wrestling, and then the newspaper goes to warn against the dangers of the sport. More bad publicity for wrestling. July the 28th, 1854, in Franklin, Michigan, Smith Ackerman, who is a prize fighter by trade, died following a wrestling match with John Quinlan due to being slammed on his head. A coroner's inquest into this death also ruled the death an accident. The two had engaged in a wrestling match after discussing a recent boxer versus wrestler match where Morrissey, that's the only name we know, Morrissey, who was the boxer, had lost to a wrestler of the last name Poole. 7 days later, at the funeral for Ackerman, the guy who just died in this match, another fight broke out at the funeral among the attendees and resulted in multiple arrests. Poole was said to have had his face painted to hide the bruises from the earlier prize fight. So, man, you can see there is a gritty, dirty world of boxing and wrestling here. Savage at times, worked at times, comical at times, bears involved. I mean, it's got everything modern pro wrestling has. You wonder why modern pro wrestling is this strange, weird form of entertainment that you can't really explain. It's not really a sport. It's not really acting. It takes some of all that to do it. It's theater, but it's not theater. So even back then in 1854, it's still hard to explain just exactly what wrestling is. Now, on an unspecified date in 1854, and I mentioned this earlier, Vero Small, a slave-turned-wrestler and boxer, was born into slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina. Following the Civil War, he gained his freedom and moved north. He was one of the first African-American wrestlers of renown, wrestling under the name Black Sam. He won championships, including the Vermont Collar and Elbow title, and he spent about 15 years from 1870 to 1855, but should be 1885, I think, as a boxer and wrestler, and was once shot in the neck but survived. And I think the shooting actually had something to do with a boxing match rather than a wrestling one. So I got a DragonKingKarl note here for this one. Collar and elbow bouts initially were governed under unwritten and improvised rules. Jackets were usually required and shoes were forbidden. A wrestler had to throw his opponent flat on their back. They had to wear a knit shirt or a short coat or jacket, not extending below the hips, with a strong collar and elbow for grasping their opponents. The thin rubber sandals on the feet. The grip was to be on the collar of the opponent with his right hand, while the left must take the hold of the elbow. And the same lockup, of course, is still common practice in wrestling today. And the jackets and harnesses would be a point of contention throughout the Pioneer era. There were some wrestlers who really preferred to wear them, some who didn't. Sometimes the rules called for them, sometimes they didn't. So a very interesting early days here as wrestling's just trying to figure itself out. January 18th, 1855, a wrestling exhibition is advertised in Buffalo, New York at Dudley Hall between Harry Hill, told you Harry Hill was probably around, Harry Hill who'd come over from London, England, and his opponent was going to be William Price of Buffalo, New York. And Harry Hill is going to be one of the major figures in wrestling. He's the first Vince McMahon. He's the first promoter guy. And he's working matches. He's going to form a combine with the John McMahon family in Homer Lane. He's going to eventually rope Colonel James H. McLaughlin into his troupe. Almost always are his matches suspect. And he himself will end up being an American heavyweight champion. He didn't get paid for his wrestling because he's in all the papers and stuff. He makes a point of being called an amateur. I'm not a professional. I don't get paid for my matches. I don't know why the hard stance there. I don't know why he wouldn't. I don't know what the purpose of that was, but he always made a point in the papers to point out he was not a professional. He was an amateur, and he did not get paid. February, I'm sure he got paid later on. His Bowery, the Harry Hill Theater there, would become, one of the major hot spots for sports and entertainment all in the 1800s. We'll talk a lot more about Harry Hill's club going forward. February the 9th, 1855, the Benoit Circus is advertised as being held in Boston, Massachusetts, and will feature wrestling matches, which the advertisement states is something, quote, novel for the city of Boston. So 1855, it appears if Boston's ever had wrestling, it was on a very small scale, and it was something unique to there. Of course, Boston would go on to be one of the major cities, even in the Pioneer era, for pro wrestling in the United States. February 12, 1855, from the Boston Bee newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts, is reporting on presumably the Benoit Circus match, and it states that William W. Watkins defeated C.C. Hawkins in, quote, neck and elbow wrestling. We'll presume that's collar and elbow. Hawkins was thrown twice and Watkins once, and it is said that Watkins showed considerable skill. So, organized wrestling. This is organized wrestling. 1855. Buy a ticket, come to the circus, and we have organized wrestling matches. Neck and elbow rule, collar and elbow rules, I assume. January the 17th, 1856. The Brooklyn Eagle newspaper reports of a brutal match which took place on Warner Street in New York in front of, quote, hundreds of spectators. Richard Riley fought James Hacking to a draw. After the match, it was said that Hacking's body was virtually ripped to shreds, with strips of skin hanging off his body, and he was covered in blood. The match is said to have lasted over an hour. There was also gambling involved in the spectacle, and the newspaper stated that, quote, this work is carried on in the outskirts of Accrington every Sunday to a great extent. So here's a report of apparently a pretty brutal, pretty real wrestling match. February the 24th, 1856. Major name right here. He's somebody that's been really overlooked in wrestling history. And his early death's going to play into that. But one, when we talk about the greatest names of the pioneer era, in no particular order, you have to name John McMahon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, William Muldoon, Evan Strangler Lewis, Farmer Burns, and I would say you need to put Clarence Whistler's name in that list too, because despite the fact he died very young, at the time he died, the newspapers, and we'll see this in the book, really consider him to be the world champion, even above Muldoon and others. We'll see that. Clarence Whistler has a astoundingly interesting career. March the 4th, 1856, in Richford, Vermont, at a town exhibition, wrestler Elephant Duffer defeated his sons in exhibition matches. His sons' names were Noah, John, and David. But he had a difficult time throwing his 13-year-old youngest son, Henry Moses, H.M. Duffer, who later became one of the most successful wrestlers of the 1800s. H.M. Duffer supposedly recorded 127 consecutive wins at one point in his career. I'm doubtful of that, but H.M. Duffer was a big deal. And apparently Elephant Duffer liked to name his sons after Bible characters, because we had Noah, John, David, and Moses. So religious man, I presume, was Elephant Duffer. March the 12th, 1856, Duncan C. Ross is born. He'll be a big star later in the pioneer era. March 26, 1856, newspapers in several towns run a similar story that, quote, sporting mania has taken over Oshkosh, Wisconsin, of all places. The centerpiece is wrestling. The matches are taking place up to 4 times a day at Marks Hall, and admittance is 12.5 cents. And look, during this 1856, if you research the newspapers, as I did, you'll find all sorts. I mean, they really were talking up in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, these Wisconsin papers, about how popular wrestling was. And so it went through a real sort of fad here at 1856. On September 6, 1856, it was reported that at Cox Mill, Virginia, Benjamin Spain died while wrestling Thomas Lee. It was reported that while straining, Spain was supposed to have burst a blood vessel and died. And again, from just what I can infer from the newspaper articles about this seemed to be a sporting match and not a fight. All right, 1857. April 18th, 1857, the Waukegan, Illinois Weekly Gazette features an advertisement for Levi J. North's National Circus, which features a wrestler by the name of Sam Smile. So here we get a wrestler being promoted actually by name. July 28, 1857, according to the Boston Evening Transcript newspaper, wrestling match took place in Valparaiso, Chile, between the unnamed champion of Chile and a man named Heman B. Johns. Yes, not Herman, but Heman, like He-Man. Heman B. Johns. And Johns is said to be 6'3" and weighs 222 pounds. That is a giant by this time period. His adversary was said to be around 270 pounds. Johns is said to have won the match and was awarded a gold ring as a prize worth $150. And I think this Heman B. Johns turns out to have been from England. But I thought it was an interesting note, and I wanted to include it in the book here that, hey, yeah, wrestling may be getting started here in the United States. It's already well established in Europe, but also even in South America. Wrestling is being established. September the 22nd, 1857, in Brooklyn, New York, at the Adelphia Rooms, Lancashire and Catch-as-Catch-Can rules, Peter Lord defeated Thomas Ashton by forfeit. Now we'll try to get one more year in here before we wrap this show up. 1858, January 29th, 1858, to New York City, New York, the Chinese Assembly Rooms, attendance 211 people. We even know what they paid a gate of $118.16. Louis Ainsworth defeated John Farley in one fall. Now, Louis Ainsworth is one of the early true pioneer, by profession wrestlers. Comes out of England. He sets up here in the United States. He's very successful. We don't know much about him. There's just not that much out there. I asked several historians. I combed the internet. I combed newspapers and books. I mean, there's some degree of information about Louis Ainsworth out there, but not a lot, not nearly as much as you would think. And he becomes one of the earliest American heavyweight champions. Yet we know little about him, at least now. May of 1858, unspecified date, the Sacramento Bee newspaper runs the following story about a French wrestler and strongman who was killed in front of a crowd of 12,000 to 15,000 people while wrestling in France. Quote, the French papers inform us that the celebrated wrestler Arpin, alias the Terrible Savillard, who has been in the habit of attending different fairs in France to display his immense strength, has recently met with his death in a very sudden manner at Nesmus, where he was exhibiting before an assemblage of between 12 and 15,000 spectators. When wrestling, he was thrown by his adversary and came down with such violence that his back was broken and he died almost immediately. The papers published the item, neglected to inform us who the formidable adversary was. So, in layman's terms, a very famous wrestler in France, in front of a crowd of 12 to 15,000 people, was killed after his back was broken. His name's Arpin, and here's a little something that didn't make it in the book. If could, I'm going to insert a digital DragonKingKarl note here. It's not impossible to believe that this was King of the Wrestlers Charles, because the person they're talking about, was Charles Arpin, who was a very successful wrestler, very famous wrestler there in France. Now, some historians, I think Phil Lyons is one of them, who's done a lot of research on that era in French wrestling. I think I remember him saying that he wasn't certain if it was Charles Arpin. He didn't think some of the things matched up, but it could have been. I mean, that's one of the only real guesses many people had of who King of the Wrestlers Charles was, may have been Charles Arpin, who here is killed. Thus explains the reason why we don't hear anything else about him. He had gone back to France and then is killed. All right, so I do have a DragonKingKarl note for this entry in the book that says the scope of this book is the origin and evolution of pro wrestling in the United States, but you just can't adequately explain that origin of wrestling without discussing the French. While wrestling was already very popular and organized across Europe long before it was in the United States, the French wrestlers seemed to be very high on showmanship, gimmicks, and all the trappings we associate with modern entertainment-style pro wrestling. Modern pro wrestling has glittery outfits. The French had them first. Modern pro wrestling has giants. The French had them first. And I'm not talking about Andre either. Modern pro wrestling had masked men, and the French had them first. Multiple masked men. Frenchman Professor Theobald Bauer deserves much credit for infusing that entertainment element into American frontier wrestling. Modern pro wrestling often vastly changes over just a few years, Just watch a match from the 1950s and compare the difference to the 1980s. In just 30 years' time, there's a huge difference in presentation. Watching it, you know it's the same thing, but you also know it's different. I can just imagine the look on Abraham Lincoln's face should he have watched a Greco-Roman match between Professor Theobald Bauer and Professor William Miller. I suppose, like most veterans, he would have hated what he saw. The more things change, the more they stay the same. July the 21st, 1858, Nevada City, California. A match at a location called Hunt's Hill between two men called Porter and Jennings took place, with each betting $500 a side in front of a panel of judges. Porter was declared the winner and pocketed over $800 in other bets, though the newspapers said the match was controversial, with multiple falls being, quote, dog falls. And I have a Dragon King Karl note for this. If you read the research into Abraham Lincoln that we talked about, I guess, last episode or the one before, dog falls was a term that was often used. Well, my Dragon King Karl note says, a dog fall, D-O-G, dog fall, in wrestling is when both wrestlers touch the ground at the same time, resulting in a draw and neither wrestler gaining an advantage. The fall is then immediately re-wrestled, and bouts are usually best of 5 falls. In professional wrestling vernacular, the term dog fall seems to have fallen out of favor in the post-Civil War era, but was commonly used before them. All right, and that now brings us to era number 3, and for our next show, we will pick up in era number 3, pre-1870 Detroit International Tournament. The 1870 Detroit International Tournament is going to change everything. It's going to really give us it's going to be wrestling's got its act together. And this is going to be its first big event. So that's a good place to cease here and to pick up there. And I hope you will support us over at whenitwascool.com as we continue this research and all these podcasts. Our podcasting network, we really need your help for our Patreon. That's our number one way we finance our website and these podcasts. We want to thank PWO again for sponsoring this episode. And Hour 64 will be sponsored by Adam B. So if you would like to sponsor an episode of this show, our preferred way of doing it is just simply go to whenitwascool.com, sign up for our Patreon, and I'll I'll dedicate an hour to you. And that helps us. It also gives you instant access to over 2,000 podcasts and growing. We do podcasts almost every single day over there. We've got a giant back archive of not just pro wrestling history, and there's plenty of that, but also pop culture and retro pop culture history. Maybe you're a fan of music. We got tons of music shows on there. Maybe you're a fan of TV, movies, horror, comics, toys. We've got tons and tons of podcasts about that sort of stuff as well. So, hey, how about freshen up your 2025 with something new to listen to? And supporting us at When It Was Cool is a great way. I'm hoping to set a new record for the number of Patreons we have over there. But to do so, if you're listening to this and you're not a Patreon supporter at When It Was Cool, could you give us a try just for a month? Help me break that record, and then you can, unsign up. It's very easy to quit Patreon also. So if you could go over there, that would help us. $5. I mean, goodness gracious, can't even get a McDonald's drive-through meal for that anymore. But that helps us. Hey, I'm the little guy. I'm not McDonald's. It's just my wife and I and our business idea of what we want to do now that I've retired from my primary career. We want to do this. We want to run a retro pop culture website, and you can help us. You can help us build our dream, and in return, I hope to give you tons of stuff that nobody else is talking about. I mean, there's very few people talking about the pioneer era of pro wrestling, and I have done, I would safely say, a huge amount of research into it. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of papers. Research for my book, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Pro Wrestling Omnibus. So check out the book, check out our website, and I'll see you back here again soon with a new show.
WhenItWasCool.com is your source for the best in retro pop culture. When It Was Cool features articles and podcasts on retro TV and movies, toys, action figures, pro wrestling, food, video games, and more. Hit the Patreon button to support us and get instant access to hundreds of premium podcasts and features, family-friendly and fun. WhenItWasCool.com.